Welcome to Meck's Online Campus. Well, this is the last time I'll be able to speak to you before all things Christmas. So before we get started, let me add a few words to what you've already been hearing. First, we've got several of our services times that are in-person service times that are close to ticketing out. So if you plan on attending in person, make sure you get your tickets, and I would get them quickly. And if the service you wanted is full, keep checking back online to see if there are cancellations that might open times and slots up. Which brings up those of you who have tickets. If your plans change and you aren't coming, please cancel your tickets so that we can free up those seats. In other words, let us know. It's a simple but very important thing to do. So many of us have been inviting our friends, and to close out a service that we didn't have to, literally, turning people away. It just makes us heartsick, and I know it makes God heartsick. So please help us with this. And if you sinned greatly by hedging your bets and getting tickets to more than one service because you couldn't decide which time you wanted to attend, now is the time to repent and decide and free up those tickets. Now, if you're wanting to attend online, you're obviously covered. Obviously, no tickets needed. Just pick the day and time. We're already hearing a lot of fun stuff, about people getting together and watching it in Starbucks or pubs or breweries or having watch parties in homes and backyards. Just a lot of fun. But also feel free to attend both campuses. While similar in nature, they are have some distinctives. There's just, quite frankly, some things that we can do in person that we can't do online, and there's some things that we can do online that we can't do in person. But whichever campus you attend, or if both, if you're able to serve, we need you, particularly for the in-person services. I am so grateful to the people who attend a service and then serve a service. We have people who actually serve multiple services. We really do need you. Just go to the Christmas at Meck page of our website and let us know of your willingness to help out. Finally, if you haven't already, be praying about your Giving to Christ at Christmas gift. As you have been hearing over the last few weeks, this serves, among so many other things, the poorest of the poor. Today, we heard about the orphanage in Argentina that we're the sole financial supporters of. Giving to Christ at Christmas funds their entire budget. In previous weeks, you've seen and heard about how your giving impacts and serves and supports the working poor. It provides hygiene products and resources for those who are homeless. It's given strategic relief to those impacted by Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina, and so much more. This is just how we collectively give to Jesus. So please mark this Christmas with an above and beyond offering to those Jesus said would be giving to him, serving the poor, the hungry, the homeless, the widow, the orphan through his church. I know that you're bombarded with requests to give to a number of things over the holiday season, and many might be worthy, but they won't represent truly giving to Christ, and that's what this season is all about. Okay, let's continue on with our current series. I remember reading once that the most popular children's story throughout the world, in one version or another, is Cinderella. We love the way someone who had a difficult life becomes valued in spite of their background, in spite of their poverty. They go from rags to riches. I had a friend in college who used to love to tell the story, only he would do it in a unique way. And here's how he would tell it. He would say, once upon a time, in a corn country, there lived a beautiful girl. Her name was Rindercella. She lived with her mugly other and her two sad bisters. In the same corn country, there was a pransome hince. One day they received an invitation from the pransome hince to go to a bancy fall. He had invited people from riles amound. So Rindercella's mugly other and her two sad bisters bought some drancy fesses to wear to the bancy fall. But Rindercella couldn't go. But then, all at once, her Gary Fodmother appeared, who touched her with her wagic mond. And suddenly there appeared a Sig Boach and Hicks White horses to take her to the bancy fall. But she had to be back before midnight, or she would turn into a tumpkin. She went to the bancy fall, and Nan stalled dight with the pransome hints, and then lulled in fove. But then the clock muck stridnight, and she had to leave. But as she left, she slopped her dripper. The next day, the pransome hince went all over the corn country looking for the beautiful burl. He came to Rindercella's house with the slop dripper and tried it on her mugly other. Fidden it. Then he tried it on her two sigly usters. Fidden it. Then he tried it on Rindercella, and it fid it. It was exactly the sight rise. And she married the pransome hens, and they lived heverly ever hapwards. Now here's the story of the Maury. If you ever go to a Banshee Fall and you want to have a pransome hens loll in fun with you, don't forget, slop that dripper. Thank you very much. Now that we have that out of the way, what about the most famous story about doubting? I think almost everyone would typically say, well, I don't know a lot about the Bible, but I've heard that there's this guy named Doubting Thomas. So probably that would be the most famous story about doubt. And you would be right. But here's what we get wrong about his story. Even what little you may know probably is a little off. And here's why. People make it seem that the issue was here was a man who just refused to believe. And he had just given himself over to his doubts. That he alone held out in the face of everybody else who had rock-solid faith in Jesus. Okay, that's not the story at all. Thomas did believe. And when he had doubts, he wanted to work through them and believe. He simply struggled with belief as a believer, which is the way a lot of people are. But that's not the only thing we can get wrong about the story of Thomas. Everybody jumps to the part where he expresses his doubt, and once he did, Jesus confronted him about it. Not only is that whole section often misinterpreted, but they forget that that is not where the story of Thomas begins. So let's jump in. The story of Thomas begins at the very onset of Jesus' ministry. Thomas was with him from the whole run. When Jesus was pulling together the men and women who would form his inner circle of followers. Here's how the Bible describes it. Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and he spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Reflect on that list just a little bit, because Jesus gathered together an interesting group. If you know anything about their backstories, you know that they were a collection made up of earthy day laborers, militant revolutionaries, disreputable financial players, and one certified two-faced scoundrel whose name would forever become associated with betrayal. And also included in that mix was a man who would become forever known, right or wrong, because of his struggle with doubt. But Jesus didn't pick Thomas because he might end up doubting, any more than he picked Judas because he might end up betraying. He picked every one of them because of their potential. Their potential. What they did with the pick was up to them. But Jesus saw something in each one of them in terms of who they could be. And that included Thomas. And when Jesus issued that call, Thomas said yes. Now, from that point on, everything we know about Thomas points to the fact that he was fiercely loyal to Jesus. For example, as Jesus began making waves with his ministry and miracles and teachings and talks, the religious establishment became very threatened, to the point that when he was in Judea, they tried to kill him. As a result, Jesus moved on to another city. Then Jesus heard that his friend Lazarus, who was back in Judea, had become dangerously ill. Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, got word to Jesus and asked if he could come. But that meant, again, retracing his steps back to Judea, which he had just left because his life was threatened. But Jesus never hesitated to return back to his friend. And he did that despite enormous risk to himself and also enormous risk to anyone who would go with him. Well, here's how the Bible captures what happened. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus said, "Let's go." Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." Okay, you don't have to read between the lines hard on that one. Jesus decided to go back to Judea where his life and the life of anyone with him would be at risk. He asked his disciples to go with him. They were not keen on the idea. Thomas and Thomas alone stepped up and said, "Men, we are not going to abandon Jesus. If he goes, we go. And if he dies, then we die with him." Okay, is that the fragile faith of a doubting Thomas you thought you knew? Probably not. Let's remember what we're learning about doubt in this series. Doubt is not the same as disbelief. Instead, it's about being in two minds. To believe is to be in one mind about accepting something as true. To disbelieve is to be in one mind about rejecting it. To doubt is to waver between the two, to believe and to disbelieve at once, and so to be in two minds. And while doubt can lead to the erosion of faith or prevent someone from coming to faith, at its best, it leads to the evaluation of faith and eventually the strengthening of faith. When you look at the life of Thomas, you don't see someone who is constantly in a state of doubt. What we see in Thomas is someone who came to Jesus, not only wanting to believe, but ready to believe, and if necessary, ready to die for that belief. So let's go on to another scene from his life. In the context of his relationship with Jesus, Thomas asked a lot of questions. But the purpose of his questions was what the medieval theologian Anselm once called faith-seeking understanding. Let me give you an example. On the night before his crucifixion, just after Judas had left to betray him, alone with his remaining disciples, Jesus had this to say: "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am, and you know the way to where I am going." Now, to that, Thomas immediately said, "No, we don't know, Lord." Thomas said, "We have no idea where you are going, so how can we know the way?" See, that was Thomas. Faith-seeking understanding. And he wasn't ever bashful about that. And Jesus never shut him down. He never said once, "Thomas, that's a dumb question," or "Thomas, I can't believe you don't get it by now," or "Thomas, I think I made myself clear." No, Jesus always honored Thomas's faith as it tried to understand things. So this is what Jesus said in return. Jesus told him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man can come to the Father except through me. If you'd really known me, you would know who my Father is. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." Jesus said, "Thomas, you have questions about who I am and what faith in me means. That's great. Let me put it to you here at the end as plainly as I can. I am the way. Yes, the way, not a way, but the way. You want to connect with God? Here I am. If you've seen me, you've seen God. That's who I am. God the Son, the second person of the Trinity in human form, come to earth to show the way. My life is the answer to your questions. My teaching is the answer to your questions. I am the answer to your questions." Which brings us to the next scene from Thomas's life. Scenes starts to get a little more familiar, perhaps, to some of you. A series of events that left every follower of Jesus dazed and confused, frightened and frail, and if they hadn't been before, they were now in two minds about Jesus. Not just Thomas, but every single one of Jesus' followers. Right after Jesus answered Thomas' question and told him he was the way, the truth, and the life, his life ended. Jesus was betrayed, he was arrested, he was sentenced, and then he was crucified. All in a single whirlwind span of 24 hours. And it left Thomas, along with everybody else, devastated beyond words and terrified and deeply, deeply conflicted and confused. Even though Jesus had told them time and again that he was going to give his life away, that he was going to lay down his life for the sins of the world, but that he would come back from the dead, they just didn't get it. So when he was crucified, the wheels of their life came off. Some ran away scared, went into hiding, fearing for their own life. Some publicly denied even knowing him. So it's not just Thomas that had doubts. I mean, they all were going crazy. Some, like Thomas, though, did have being in two minds about Jesus going to overdrive. I mean, here was the thinking. No Messiah would be killed like that. No God could be beaten and hung from a tree. That wasn't what someone who was the way, the truth, and the life would endure. That wasn't how their life would end. That is not something a good God would allow. So Thomas's two minds, wavering between belief and disbelief, began tilting violently toward thinking he had to disbelieve it all. He was moving toward one mind, but it wasn't the one mind of belief. It was that Jesus wasn't who he said he was. So what happened next should not come as a big surprise. The Bible tells us that 3 days after his crucifixion, Jesus presented himself to some of the disciples, resurrected from the dead, just like he said. And all the disciples are there, except one, Thomas. So they went and told him, but Thomas just couldn't believe his ears. He needed to see it with his eyes, the way they had. Here's how the Bible describes it. Now, Thomas was not with the disciples when Jesus came, so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now, we already know enough about Thomas to know that these were not the words of a belligerent skeptic, but someone who was distraught and in pain from his emotional grief and spiritual confusion. He essentially said, "Look, you've seen this. You say you've seen this. I haven't seen anything except a dead body on a tree. I just can't believe without seeing what you said you've seen." And because of that response, people throughout history have looked down on Thomas for his crisis of faith. They have criticized him for his doubt. They forget that all the other followers of Jesus doubted too until they saw him. Thomas just hadn't seen him yet. So their faith was no stronger than his. But what do you do with a Thomas who has a response like that, though? What do you do? How do you respond? How do you react? Well, let's see how Jesus responded and reacted, because here's what happened next. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Now think about that scene. Jesus appears again and does what? He turns immediately to Thomas, as if he came back just for Thomas. Well, he did come back just for Thomas in that particular scene. And what does he say? Does he condemn him? Does he reprimand him? Does he reject him? No. He goes to Thomas and he says, "Here I am. You needed to see nail prints? Well, here they are. You needed to see the wound in my side where the spear was thrust? Here it is. You said you not only needed to see me, but touch me. Put your finger in the wounds. Touch my hand. Put your hand in my side. And when you're done, remove any doubt from your heart and mind as to who I am. Because Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life." In the original Greek language in which this was written, it flows very nicely. It's very interesting. It literally reads, "Do not become unbelieving, but believing." That dynamic. Do not become unbelieving, Thomas, but believing. So it really is as if Jesus is saying, you have been in two minds, I know. All that has happened since my arrest has made you move closer to the mind of disbelief. Don't do it. Thomas, it's time to come to one mind, but the mind of belief. And Thomas did. His two minds became one. He may not have understood it all, but he believed it all. Now, some of you who are dealing with more than a few doubts of your own might be thinking about now, well, yeah, I mean, it would settle it for me too if Jesus showed up for me from the dead and said, "Hey, here are my hands, check me out." I think I'd say my Lord and my God too. It's as if Jesus knew that might be our reaction, because that wasn't the end of the conversation. Jesus had a final word for Thomas. It really was a word for us today. Then Jesus told him, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." And again, that wasn't Jesus upset with Thomas or mad at Thomas or rejecting Thomas. He had come to give Thomas what he asked for, what Thomas needed. But Jesus was disappointed that he needed it. Disappointed he didn't believe all his closest friends about what they had all collectively seen. Disappointed that everything he had told him about his death and resurrection was so quickly forgotten. Disappointed that Thomas needed to see so much after he had already seen so much. So really, it's as if he's saying to Thomas, look, over the last 3 years of doing life with me, seeing miracle after miracle, hearing teaching after teaching, you have had more proof than almost any other human being who will ever live. And here at the end, it took this. There will be men and women to come who will have twice your faith, because they've seen half of what you've seen. I'm happy that you believe because you've seen, but blessed are those who will believe in me and didn't see. So what's it going to be for you? You see, here's the real challenge of Thomas. If you're a follower of Jesus right now, the challenge of Thomas is to have trust and faith in Jesus in the face of crisis, in the face of questions, in the face of the dark night of the soul, to believe in what he has told you about who he is and what he has done for you and how much he does love you. And if that has been wavering for you of late, do not become unbelieving, but believing. Renew your faith, purpose in your heart that Jesus is your Lord and your God. And to those of you who are on the fence about Jesus, you're not a follower yet, but you've been tire kicking, you've been exploring, you've been asking questions, you're dialing in to this online campus. Well, good. The challenge the life of Thomas brings to you is to keep asking, because your questions, your search is welcomed by Jesus. It's affirmed by Jesus, just like he affirmed it with Thomas. And he comes to you too, holding out his nail-pierced hands for you to see and examine. So examine them. Check Jesus out. Will you get every possible question answered along the way? No. Coming to faith is not about reaching that point where at the end of all questions. It's not about reaching a point where you understand everything. If we could understand everything about God, then God would be no larger than our intellect. And that would be a small God, certainly not worthy of our worship. There will always be mystery. The real question for you is whether that you can reach a point where there are enough answers. It's not about reaching the point where, it's about reaching a point where it would take more faith not to believe than it would to believe. It's coming to that point where you can say, I don't understand it all. I don't have all the answers, but I've got enough understanding. I've got enough answers to have trust in the one who does. And that's the real story of Thomas. Not the doubting Thomas, but the believing Thomas, who at the end of his faith journey could say, my Lord and my God. So what happened next with Thomas? Do we know? Well, the Bible doesn't give us any more details about his life, but tradition, so hold this with a bit of a grain of salt, but tradition tells us that he became one of the most dynamic missionaries in all of history. And there is evidence that he did bring the message of Jesus to the farthest reaches of the world. He traveled far outside of the Roman Empire, eventually making his way to southern India, which is why he is regarded as the patron saint of Christians in India to this day. There he died, tradition says, a martyr's death, killed by the king of the province because so many were turning away from their pagan beliefs and coming to faith in Jesus through Thomas's teaching, including the wife and children of the king, which did not make him happy. So he ordered soldiers to take Thomas to the outskirts of town and slay him with their spears. Thomas died of the very wound he said he needed to see on Jesus to believe. A wound he did see and touched, and from that did believe, and was only too willing to die for Jesus at the end, the way he was willing to die for Jesus at the beginning. And as Jesus said, blessed are you, even though not seeing, who do the same. Okay, let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much for this story and preserving it with so much authenticity in the scriptures, that we can still learn from it today, be challenged by it, be encouraged by it. Father, I just pray for everyone who are in two minds, that they would bring those two minds to you and seek resolution in getting answers to their questions. Not every question, but enough to come to faith in you. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.